Hello.
Okay, Chair, my devices are rolling and the floor is yours.
Great. Thank you, Anthony. Welcome, everyone, to the November 19, 2020 Delta Stewardship Council meeting. Glad to be able to be with you today. I'm Susan Tatayan, Chair of the Council. Let's get started with a roll call to establish a quorum, alphabetically starting with Judge Damrell.
Damrell here. Mike Gatto here.
Maranian here.
Villegas present.
Tatayan here. We have a quorum. Let's move on. Before we get on to the consent calendar, I'd like to note for the public, if any member of the public is interested in providing public comment, please send an email blue card to the clerk at engage@deltacouncil.ca.gov as seen on the screen. Be sure to note your name and the agenda item that you wish to comment on. Also, please note if you wish to speak or would like the clerk to read your comment. After your name is called, the clerk will unmute your line or read your comment if requested. So let's move on to agenda item 3, the consent calendar. Are there any public comments on any of the items on the consent calendar?
There's no public comment, Chair.
Great, thank you, Lita. Members, is there any discussion on items on the consent calendar?
If not, Madam Chair, I'd move consent.
Second.
Oh, okay, consent motion by Councilmember Oscar Villegas, second by Councilmember Maranian. Council members, instead of a roll call vote this month, I'm asking whether there are any objections to adopting the consent calendar. Okay, hearing none, the motion is adopted by unanimous consent. We'll move on to agenda item 4, the chair's report. For the chair's report this month, Amanda Bowl will give us highlights of the October 26th Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting. Is Amanda with us here?
Yes, can you hear me?
Okay. Hey, Amanda, yes.
Hi, good. Thanks, Chair Tatayan, and good morning, council members. The Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee met on October 26th and focused the agenda on climate resilience, hearing updates on several different but very related and interconnected initiatives. DPIC first heard an update from Dr. Steve Brandt from the Delta Independent Science Board and Dr. Mike Chakowski from the U.S. Geological Survey on the Science Needs Assessment Workshop, one of 3 priority actions DPIC endorsed at its November 2019 meeting to achieve ongoing, consistent, and reliable science funding. The workshop occurred October 5th and 6th, and the planning team is now meeting regularly to draft a forward-looking science needs assessment document that will make recommendations to DPIC on how the science enterprise can better meet long-term science and management needs in the form of both science actions and strengthening the science enterprise to be adaptive and anticipatory in the face of climate change. DPIC next heard from a panel of representatives from the Council, the San Francisco Bay Conservation and Development Commission, also known as DCDC, and the California Natural Resources Agency. Jeff Henderson provided context for the panel, and Harriet Ross, who you'll be hearing from later this morning, discussed Delta Adapt. Jessica Fain, the planning director from BCDC, provided an overview of Bay Adapt, BCDC's collaborative effort to establish regional assessment, or to establish a regional assessment on the actions necessary to protect the people and the natural and built environment from rising sea levels in the Bay. And then Amanda Hansen, the Deputy Secretary for Climate at the Resources Agency, updated DPIC members on Governor Newsom's high priority efforts around climate change and his recent nature-based solutions executive order. So following these presentations, DPIC members discussed what future collaborative regional adaptation across the interconnected Bay Delta system might look like, the current administration's priorities and its strategic direction for climate change, and opportunities for DPIC members to collaborate on climate resilience efforts in the Bay Delta region. And so while there's still a lot of work to be done to implement the governor's executive order, But both Delta Adapt and ADAPT really have the potential to meaningfully contribute to the administration's efforts on climate change. So this was the last DPIC meeting of 2020. We're anticipating that DPIC meetings will be held in March, July, and November of 2021, and we'll let you all know when those get scheduled. So I'm happy to answer any questions anyone has.
Council members, do you have any questions for Amanda?
Okay, thanks.
No questions. Thank you, Amanda. On to agenda item 5, Executive Officer's Report with Jessica Pearson.
Good morning. Good morning, everyone. I'll start with our monthly reminder to ensure that those who want to contact the council can do so easily. As a reminder, in order to combat the spread of COVID-19, we've closed our physical office for now, but our staff are working remotely and are always available to assist the public. Our public meeting formats continue to be fully remote for now. If anyone needs to contact staff at the council, you're encouraged to email hello@deltacouncil.ca.gov, or you can contact the council's front desk at 916-445-5511. And of course, I always encourage people to sign up for our listserv or to check our website regularly for updated information on the council's activities and how to engage. Next, on to Delta Plan implementation and coordination letters. This past month, the council staff sent 2 letters regarding Delta Plan implementation and coordination. The first was to the Metropolitan Transportation Commission / Association of Bay Area Governments regarding their notice of preparation for an environmental impact report for what they're calling Plan Bay Area 2050. This is a long-range regional plan that covers transportation, housing, economic growth, and the environment for the 9-county San Francisco Bay Area region. The letter to the commission states that per the Delta Reform Act, the commission must submit their draft planning strategy to the council no later than 60 days before adopting their final plan. The council then has the opportunity to review the strategy to determine consistency with the Delta Plan. And if found inconsistent, the council would notify the commission, which then must include a detailed response in their final plan. So our letter outlines some concerns regarding potential for urban expansion into the Delta and consistency of Plan Bay Area 2050 with the Delta's ecosystem restoration needs. But we have been meeting with commission staff in early consultation on their plan, and will continue to update the council on any significant updates. The second letter staff sent was to the Brannon-Andrus Levy Maintenance District. This is regarding their notice of intent to adopt a mitigated negative declaration for their Sacramento River Erosion Control and Habitat Enhancement Project. The project seeks to resolve levee erosion issues, to provide channel margin habitat at a couple of locations along the east bank of the Sacramento River, and to minimize long-term levee maintenance and repair costs. Our letter to the district states that the project appears to meet the definition of a covered action, and we thank the district for meeting with council staff to discuss the project. We also outlined Delta Plan policies in our letter that may apply to the project, and encourage the district to continue to engage with us. If you have any questions about either of these letters or these projects, or any of the projects that we detail on our active projects list, please feel free to contact me or my planning deputy, Jeff Henderson, at any time. We do have a live covered action certification right now. On October 26th, the Central Valley Flood Protection Board submitted a certification of consistency for the second part of their American River Watershed Common Features Project. This is a flood risk reduction program. The board certified that the proposed project is consistent with the Delta Plan. Specifically, they find that the proposed project is consistent with 9 of our Delta Plan policies. So the project is located along the Sacramento River at the confluence of the American River within the city of Sacramento. The project entails 3 sections of levee improvements, about 2 miles, and the third section is about 7,000 feet of levee improvement along the Sacramento River to the north of the Pocket neighborhood, and that's located in the legal delta. So the project's public review and appeal period has been open since October 26th and will close Wednesday, November 25th. So all of this information and more is available on our website, www.deltacouncil.ca.gov. A couple of quick personnel announcements. Matthew Gaither joins the council as our new human resources manager, and we're so happy to have him. He comes to us with over 12 years of state service, most recently supervising and working on high-level HR projects for the California Correctional Health Services Agency. So we are excited to have him on board. We've been onboarding a couple of staff during the pandemic, and he's going to help us out quite a bit to make sure that that's a seamless process. And I want to recognize that this is the last meeting for our council clerk, Lita Bridey, who you all have the opportunity to engage with frequently. She's transitioning to a new position at the council. She's moving to the planning division to join our regulatory review unit. So Lita has been with the council for over 5 years, and 3 of those have been serving as the council clerk. So please join me in thanking Lita for all her hard work in making these meetings organized and running smoothly, getting the materials out, and let's congratulate her as she takes on her new role at the council.
Yes, congratulations, Lita.
Congratulations.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Jessica.
Yeah, congratulations.
So the outreach highlights report and the active projects list are in your packets and on our website this month. If you have any questions about those, please let me know. And then looking ahead to today's agenda, we've got 2 significant updates. One is on our Delta ADAPTS Regional Climate Change Vulnerability Assessment. We're going to be talking about initial findings for that assessment. So this is a real milestone for the council, and I'm excited to hear the discussion. And then also we've got our implementing partners for the Delta Levy's investment strategy, who will be joining us to provide an update on joint activities to reduce flood risk in the Delta. And with that, I conclude my executive officer's report. Happy to take any questions.
Thank you, Jessica. Council members, do you have any questions for Jessica? Okay. Lita, are there any public comments on this item?
There are no public comments.
All right, well then let's move on to agenda item 6, key draft findings from the Delta ADAPTS vulnerability assessment. And Jessica will kick it off.
Okay, great. As our presenters get online here and join us, I just wanted to make a few brief comments to introduce the item. Most people who are familiar with the Delta or generally familiar with climate change impacts and the discussions about how we expect those to impact us in California know that change is coming to the Delta. And that without intentional adaptation and planning, the resources that we really care about and that are central to the council's mission are at risk. So today we're proud to present a milestone report. This is out of the initial findings from the first ever regional climate change vulnerability assessment for the Delta. It's a valuable and necessary first step so that we can then start talking about adaptation and adaptation strategies. And we hope to begin that second part of the conversation about what we do about these impacts early next year. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Harriet Ross, who's been capably leading this effort, and her team to make the presentation.
Thank you, Jessica. Can you all hear me okay?
Yes.
Great. Well, good morning, Chair Tatayan and members of the council. Again, I'm Harriet Ross, Assistant Planning Director here at, with the Planning Division. Okay. So I'm excited to be presenting on Delta ADAPTS today, the council's regional climate study. As we all have seen, climate change is already altering the physical environment of the Delta, and we will continue to experience climate change through hotter temperatures, more severe wildfires, and prolonged droughts. Over the long term, climate change in the Delta is expected to adversely affect human health and safety, lead to economic disruptions, diminish water supply, degrade water quality, shift ecosystem function and habitat qualities, and increase the challenges of providing basic services. Many of these impacts will disproportionately affect disadvantaged communities. Although the extent of those impacts in the future are not exactly known, Delta Adapts will help the Council begin to assess specific climate risks and vulnerabilities in the region. And our next phase of the study in preparing an adaptation strategy will represent a big step in identifying ways to address them. Now, we did not go at this alone. The study was conducted in coordination with a diverse group of stakeholders over the last 2 years. So before we dive into the presentation, I do want to acknowledge and thank the Planning and Science Division teams. We've been at this for a while and working really hard. And I'd like to acknowledge Avery Livengood for leading the equity analysis, and she was supported by Annie Merritt and Molly Williams. Also, Andrew Schwartz led the flooding and water supply analyses, and he was supported by Corey Copeland, Dan Constable, Kaylee Griffith, Aaron Mullen, Anthony Navasero, and Molly Williams. And Dylan Chappell and Annika Keeley led the ecosystem analysis. And I also want to thank our partner agencies. We worked really closely on the flood and water supply analyses with the Department of Water Resources and the Central Valley Flood Protection Board staff, and their coordination and input was invaluable. So for today, next slide, please. As Jessica mentioned, we're currently drafting the vulnerability assessment, and really the purpose of today's meeting is to review some of those key findings, give you an opportunity to ask questions about those findings, methodology, and engagement process that we have taken so far. We do plan on coming back next month to review the remainder of the vulnerability assessment results. So I'm going to go ahead and start off the presentation and provide a status and overview of Delta Adapts. Then I'll be turning it over to the various technical leads where we will review the equity analysis results, the key findings for flooding, water supply, and ecosystem. And then we'll have time at the end for questions and discussion. Next slide, please. If you recall, the Council authorized the climate study in 2018. In early 2019, the Council endorsed a set of resilience goals. And these goals really build upon our co-equal goals, and we've been using them to ensure alignment with planning issues and Delta values, and we'll be using those to make sure they're aligned with future adaptation strategies. We also gave an update to the Council late last year, and we've been updating the Council briefing group over the last several months. Next slide. Delta Adapts consists of a vulnerability assessment and adaptation strategy, as we've been talking about, and we're currently in the vulnerability assessment phase with an overarching goal to build climate resilience in the Delta. Next slide. Specific goals of the climate study are to inform future Council work, helps the state prioritize future actions and investments, provide a toolkit of information for local governments to use in the regulatory documents, and to serve as a framework to be built upon by the Council and others in the future. Next slide. As we've talked about, Delta Adapts is a regional study. We cover a large area, the entire Delta Sassoon Marsh, which is consistent with where we have our regulatory authority. Delta Adapts is a planning level study, really designed to inform policy. And there are a lot of other climate assessments that have been done by state agencies and individual cities and counties in the Delta. But these typically focus on assets those agencies own or analyze vulnerabilities based on certain climate conditions. Delta Adapts covers a much broader range of asset categories and climate change conditions. So really, Delta Adapts is designed to be complementary with all of these other existing efforts. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we look at a broad range of climate stressors. We look at changes in air temperature, precipitation and hydrologic patterns, and sea level rise, and those corresponding climate hazards of extreme heat, wildfire, drought, and flooding. Next slide. We've also undergone an extensive stakeholder engagement program throughout the development of the vulnerability assessment. We've had ongoing collaboration with our agency partners. We built off of existing models and data created by our partners, and worked really hard on ensuring the future flood studies are complementary, especially across state agencies. We've also had several series of stakeholder briefings where we met with stakeholders to ground truth our data and verify our results. We also launched a significant effort to outreach to community-based organizations who helped us structure our engagement to reach vulnerable communities in the Delta. We also have a technical advisory committee consisting of experts in the system and in climate change who really provided invaluable input into our technical approach and analyses and have reviewed all of our work. We also have a stakeholder work group consisting of local agencies, cities, counties, environmental groups, water districts, just to name a few. And they provided data and input to early into our process. And overall, through all this engagement, the feedback that we've received has been largely positive. Most were impressed with the scale and comprehensiveness of our analysis, especially with our flood approach, where we're able to explore different aspects of climate change in a way that has really never been done before. And we got feedback that our probabilistic flood maps, which shows the likelihood of flooding, are easier to understand when compared to more traditional flood maps. It was also noted that we made a concerted effort to address stakeholder concerns and ran to ground many of the issues that were brought up. Next slide. So as I mentioned, we're still working on the draft vulnerability assessment right now, but we do have some of the initial key findings for the 4 technical topics that we'll be going over today. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Avery to talk about the equity analysis.
Thank you, Harriet. Can you hear me okay? Good morning, council members. Can we advance to the next slide, please? Next slide, thank you. So a key part of the equity approach was to evaluate social vulnerability to climate change. And we started by reviewing studies that other state and regional agencies have produced to see what data and indicators they've used to identify social vulnerability in general. And then we went on to conduct a literature review to identify factors that increase vulnerability to the specific climate hazards that we are focused on in Delta Adapts, which are shown on the slide. And what we found is that many of the factors cut across all 3 of the hazards that we looked at. So for example, pre-existing health conditions such as asthma tend to make people more sensitive to the effects of flooding, heat, and wildfire. Income level is another example because it affects a household's capacity to recover from extreme events. Next slide. So this list was used to develop a custom social vulnerability index for the Delta. The index overlays 14 of the factors, allowing us to identify communities that have multiple intersecting characteristics that increase their vulnerability. Those with the highest vulnerability in the Delta are shown on the map in dark orange. These areas scored in the 70th percentile for more than half of the 14 indicators. During phase 2 of Delta Adapts, we can use this map and the index to identify and prioritize equitable adaptation strategies. But because this work is new, we're still working to determine how exactly we're going to use it. That said, we're very excited that the index already has 1 real-world application. If you go to the next slide, please. And that is the 2021 Delta Science Proposal Solicitation. Staff published the Social Vulnerability Index on a web map, so it's now publicly accessible. And it allows users to view the data and to explore individual indicators on the map. So funding applicants are directed to use this map to evaluate how their project will address 1 or more of the factors that contribute to vulnerability within a specific community. And the map tool also makes the information accessible to anyone, to the general public. Next slide, please. Now, what I've just presented on is focused on social vulnerability, but the equity technical memorandum is much broader than that. It lays out how the principles of equity can be addressed throughout the Delta Adapts initiative. And our primary approach to that has been to engage early and often with local stakeholders, as Harriet mentioned earlier. So for more than a year now, we've been contacting community-based organizations and service providers in the Delta for their feedback and ideas. And we've made a lot of additions to our work based on their recommendations. A few examples: we added a food security indicator to the index. We also added evacuation routes to our asset database so that we can report on whether any of those routes are at risk of flooding in the future. And we're currently working to produce an educational video about Delta Adapts so that people who don't have time or wherewithal to read a long report will still be able to learn about our key findings. We're very grateful for the time and expertise that the organizations shown on this slide have contributed. So big thank you to all of them. And we hope to continue building on this collaboration moving forward. And now I'm going to turn it over to Andrew to present on water supply and flooding.
Thanks, Avery. Can you, oh no, hear and see me?
Yep.
Lost my setup. Okay, great, thanks. So I'm gonna be talking about the flood hazard maps, and then I'll move into water supply. But next slide. Before I jump into the hazard maps themselves, just want to talk just for a moment about our kind of approach and analysis that we took to analyze flooding, because flooding in the Delta is a very complex system to understand and to model. We built our flood model on existing tools and adapted those and improved those because so much work has been done in the Delta and we wanted to take advantage of that. We built a model that really can consider a very wide range of future climate change conditions, including changes in tide and storm surge, sea level rise, and Delta inflows. And we really wanted a model that would help us improve our understanding of this system and not just test one scenario or another scenario. And I'll come back to that at the end of my slides here of what we've really learned about the system as a whole. And then finally, we really wanted a model and some tools that were very flexible. We know that climate change information is constantly changing, being updated. In a few years, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change will release new scenarios of new projections of climate change. And we want to be able to ingest those quickly and update our analysis. And so the tool that we've built is very flexible and can be updated without having to issue another contract to another consultant and do this all over again in just a few years. Next slide. This is the first map of flooding in the Delta. And it represents current conditions. Before I go into all of these maps, I just want to put out there a few caveats that all of our maps assume current conditions. We're not assuming any additional building or reconstruction of levees. So no more levee, that levee improvements stop at where they are at today. And similarly, up in the watershed, we have not assumed any additional improvements to those levees or flood control measures. And that's because we just don't know how much of that will be done in the future, where it will occur, or when it will occur. And so the easiest assumption is to just use today's conditions and then look at those possible trajectories into the future with further adaptation as adaptation strategies. So the first map looks at current conditions. And you can see that much of Sassoon Marsh out in the far west of this map is exposed to flooding. Those darker colors are representing a flood risk that would occur, that those levees would be overtopped during a storm event that's like a 10-year event or something that would have a 10% chance of occurrence in any year. So that's a fairly low level of flood protection. Conversely, throughout most of the rest of the Delta, you see that light blue color, which is representing a fairly low risk of flooding, or it would take something more than a 200-year event or an event that would have like a less than 0.5% chance of occurring in any 1 year. You also do see some in-between blue colors down in the Southern Delta and a few other places throughout the Delta. Those are generally restoration areas that we want to see flooded more frequently. or areas with known flood deficiencies. Under a 100-year event at current conditions, or an event that would occur have a 1% chance of occurrence in any 1 year, about 2% of the Delta's 625,000 people would be exposed to flooding. Next slide. So at 2050 conditions, we start to see substantial additional flooding throughout the central and south Delta, including the Stockton area. Notably, we see overtopping with much smaller storm events. So it's not just that more land is being exposed to flooding, it's that it doesn't take nearly as rare an event to see that substantial flooding. The darker colored areas on this map represent flooding under an event that would have something between a 10 and 50 or 50 and 100 year recurrence of flooding. And that level of flood risk might make it challenging to make continued agriculture investments, especially in permanent crops, or high value crops. In addition, several urbanized and urbanizing areas are exposed to flooding, increasing the potential for significant economic disruption and loss and impacts to socially vulnerable populations. So during a 100-year event at mid-century conditions, nearly 65,000 people would be exposed to flooding. And included in that is 11,000 people who are living in communities with the highest social vulnerability. So that goes back to what Avery just presented to you. In our screens for social vulnerability, we can go look at these flooded islands and look at the populations in each of those areas and look at which additional risk factors those folks have that would make them additionally vulnerable. Next slide. Now moving out to 2085 conditions, late century, most of the South and Central Delta are exposed to flooding on less than a 10-year recurrence. So it doesn't take much of a storm to start seeing massive flooding throughout the Delta. And another way to think about this is that over a 10-year period toward the end of the century, these islands would have a 65% chance of occurring because that 10-year storm has a 10% chance of occurring in any individual year. At a 100-year storm event, 20% of the Delta's population, over 120,000 people, would be exposed to flooding. And of those, over 20,000 people would be living in areas with the highest social vulnerability. If we move up to a 200-year storm event, 44% of the Delta's population would be exposed to flooding. So nearly a doubling of the population that would be exposed to flooding going from a 100-year to a 200-year event. Most of the additional people that get added that would be more exposed are actually in the Stockton, North Stockton area and the pocket area of Sacramento. You can see those areas in the kind of light, not quite the lightest blue, but the next to lightest blue color. And really what this is highlighting is targeted investments in additional flood protection in certain areas can protect tens of thousands of people from flooding. It's also interesting to note on this map that even under these pretty significant, substantial changes in climate change conditions, the North Delta remains relatively secure and not prone to high flood risk. And that really highlights the value of past flood management investments that have been made, particularly along the Sacramento and American rivers, and then most importantly, the YOLO bypass, which allows us to accommodate huge additional inflows. Next slide. So this slide, this really goes to the issue of learning about our system and understanding our system more. And what we've been able to understand from the modeling that we've done is we've always known that there are parts of the Delta that are really driven by the river system and other parts that are really driven by the ocean processes. And what this slide really shows is where that line of transition happens in the Delta, which areas are really driven primarily by flood risk from the river system, those red dots, and which ones where it comes from the ocean and would be most vulnerable to sea level rise, the green dots. And then the blue dots have it the worst. They really get it from both sides. They're really vulnerable to both of those processes. And this is really important because as we move to adaptation in our next stage, we're going to really need to focus on the source of vulnerability and look at adaptation strategies that are going to address that vulnerability. So you can think about things like improving the bypass or upstream storage to manage those inflows into the delta. That's really going to help those red dotted areas, but it's not going to do much for the green areas. So those areas, even if you reduce inflow from the rivers, the sea level rise is really what's going to challenge them. And so we're going to really need to focus our adaptation on understanding what is driving vulnerability. Next slide. So what does all of this mean? Well, we already knew that a lot of the delta would flood with expected change in climate conditions. And we knew that flooded areas would disproportionately affect vulnerable communities. But now we have a very good idea of where the greatest flood impacts will occur in terms of people affected and approximate economic losses. And we can target future levy investments to protect those communities. We also know where the most socially vulnerable communities are, so we can ensure that investments are equitable and focused in these communities. We know what drives flooding in different areas of the delta. We can now structure adaptation strategies to address the cause and design different adaptation strategies that are needed for flooding caused by increasing river flows or in sea level rise increase. And this also allows us to test adaptation strategies to see how effective they would be at addressing these concerns. Next slide. So that is our key findings on water supply. And now I'll move, on flood. And now I'm going to move into water supply. Just have 2 slides on water supply. The key findings here are really that we looked at what the water supply system is sensitive to and how changes in temperature, sea level rise, and precipitation can affect our water supply reliability. This is really important to understand which again, just like the sea level rise or the riverine processes and the flood risk, it's really important for us to understand which of these climate processes are really driving vulnerability in the water supply system as well, because our adaptation strategies will need to be targeted to address those vulnerabilities. And we have a lot of different levels of certainty about whether we understand that temperatures are going to go up. That's relatively certain. How precipitation will change is a bit less certain. And so that should factor into how we do adaptation as well. We found that higher temperatures are the most certain and pose the greatest risk to the water supply system. More variable precipitation, while fairly certain, but not as certain as temperature, is especially impactful during dry periods. And that sea level rise, which is fairly certain as well, is of less concern to the water supply system relative to the other factors. It doesn't drive reductions in water supply reliability in the same way that the other 2 factors do. Higher temperatures really just mean more rain, less snow, more runoff in the core winter months when we can't capture it in reservoirs because of the need to provide flood protection. And then when we get to March, April, May, when we stop managing our reservoirs for flood protection and start managing them for water supply, the snow is really mostly gone and there isn't enough spring snowmelt to refill those reservoirs. More variable precipitation means there will be more years that will be wet, more years that will be dry, and fewer that will be closer to that average. And additional wet years just don't provide much benefit to the system actually, because the system that we have today really can't capture that additional runoff. But then when we get to those additional dry years, they really intensify and expand the drought conditions. Next slide, please. Overall, we found that climate change will reduce delta exports in all year types, from wet to dry, but the impacts will be disproportionately greater in dry years. So the dry year ability to deliver water falls much, much more significantly than our wet year ability to deliver water from the delta. Climate change will also chronically reduce reservoir storage in all years, meaning that less water can be carried over from one year to the next, increasing vulnerability to droughts and the impacts of those droughts when they do occur. All of this means greater water shortages, especially in dry years, and generally lower reliability of Delta water. Impacts will be much worse when the overall water supply is already stressed. And this is really a call for action for Delta water users to continue their efforts to plan for future drought conditions. Because when they need Delta water the most, Delta water will likely be reduced substantially. We also looked at how drought conditions may change in the future. And we looked at a drought similar to the one we just experienced in 2012 to 2016. And we see that this drought will become something like 5 to 7 times more likely to occur under 2050 conditions than it is currently. That was a really rare event, something like a 500-year event historically, that drought that we just lived through. So very rare. And that's going to be something like a 100-year to a 70-year reoccurrence in the future. It's not surprising that it'll become more common, but the degree to which an extremely severe drought like that would occur in the future should really be cause for concern and additional planning. With that, I will turn it over to Dylan to discuss the ecosystem analysis and findings.
Great, thank you, Andrew, and good morning, council members. I'm going to be walking through some of the results from our Delta Adapts ecosystem analysis, really focused on our sea level rise findings. Next slide. So it's important to note here that past ecosystem loss in the Delta has big implications for climate change impacts. As many of you are probably aware, the Delta's ecosystems have already been heavily compromised compared to their historical state. For example, 98% of historical freshwater tidal wetlands have been lost since the 1800s. And climate change will further compromise ecosystem health without substantial investments in the Delta's ecosystems. Next slide, please. For our analysis, we looked at over 170,000 acres of natural ecosystems, which we grouped into unlevied ecosystems, which have tidal, riverine, or floodplain connections, and ecosystems protected by levees. And we looked at the impact of sea level rise from 6 inches through 6 feet on these particular ecosystems across the Delta landscape. Next slide. So unlevied tidal wetlands are critical habitat for a number of species and the target of thousands of acres of restoration investment. For this analysis, we partnered with the U.S. Geological Survey to model wetland accretion, which describes the ability of these wetlands to change elevation and persist in response to sea level rise. Wetland elevation is a key determinant of ecosystem function, so here we define risk as either the transition from a higher elevation marsh to a lower elevation marsh, or as the complete drowning of a wetland when it becomes a mudflat or open water. Under up to 2 feet of sea level rise, tidal wetlands are able to maintain their elevations and risk is low. However, under 3.5 feet of sea level rise by 2085, 53% of freshwater wetlands in the Delta and 100% of brackish tidal wetlands in Sassoon Marsh are at risk. Under 6 feet of sea level rise, 100% of tidal freshwater wetlands in the Delta are at risk. Restoring tidal wetlands as soon as possible will allow them to maintain their elevation and reduce their risk of being lost. Next slide, please. So tidal wetland connections to upland areas can allow these ecosystems to migrate and persist in response to sea level rise. However, upland transition space is extremely rare in the Delta. The Browns Island and Sherman Lake wetlands that you see here on your left account for the majority of tidal wetland acreage in the Central Delta region. However, they're islands and have no connections to surrounding upland areas. In the Cache Slough Yellow Bypass region seen here on the right, wetlands in the Lindsay Slough area, which is at the bottom left corner of the image, do have adequate connections to upland space, but the Liberty Island wetlands in the top right-hand corner of this image have only limited upland connections. So future investments in tidal restoration that are connected to upland transition space will substantially reduce the risk of wetland loss in the Delta. Next slide. For levied ecosystems, we use flood maps to identify where ecosystems are at risk due to levee overtopping, resulting from the combination of different sea level rise scenarios and a 100-year storm event, which has a 1% chance of occurring in any given year. For 1, 2, and 3.5 feet of sea level rise, 48, 63, and 78% of levied ecosystems are at risk of flooding, respectively. Deeply subsided islands in the central delta and managed wetlands in Sassoon Marsh have the highest risk. And just to reiterate, as Andrew mentioned, this analysis looks at current conditions and it doesn't take into account future investments to update levee systems. So for the levied ecosystems that we have in the Delta, levee maintenance and the pursuit of ecosystem restoration efforts like subsidence reversal wetlands that reduce flood risk will help protect levied ecosystems in the Delta and Sassoon Marsh. And with that, I will hand it back to Harriet.
Okay, well, I'm going to wrap it up now. If we can go to the next slide. Just wanted to touch upon, you've heard all of the main key findings of the vulnerability assessment. So really, what is the significance of Delta ADAPTS? And though a lot of work has been done, this really is the first comprehensive climate change study in the Delta. We also developed comprehensive flood and water supply models that are flexible to new information, as Andrew talked about. These are all open source models, and others can use them and include their own information. So long-term utility of these models that we created now and into the future for our use and others. Also, Delta ADAPTS developed a socially vulnerable index, as Avery went over. And this really, again, allows us for the first time to see geographically where these communities are located. We have a definition for them. And this allows us to focus where adaptation should occur and equitably in the future. We also have done extensive community outreach, really trying and establishing those relationships with various organizations and service providers who are helping us structure our outreach efforts to the vulnerable communities. And lastly, we have worked collaboratively with our agency partners in developing our methodology, sharing data, and verifying our results. So those are some of the main significant things that have come out of Delta ADAPTS. So now on to next steps. For the next slide, we do plan on coming back to the council next month to review the remaining results of the vulnerability assessment. And then there's been a slight shift in schedule. We plan on releasing the public draft vulnerability assessment in early January with a 30-day public review period. And following that, we will be revising and finalizing the vulnerability assessment and beginning adaptation strategy shortly after that point. So that wraps up our presentation. So open to any questions.
Great, thank you, Harriet. And thank you to the team. This is incredible work. It's amazing what you've done in just a year. Council members, any questions for Harriet or the rest of the team?
Oh, but just wonderful work. Very, very informative and in very, very good presentation. Thank you.
Let me underscore what the chair said. This opened up a lot of eyes, I think. It opened up my eyes. I mean, this is extraordinary work on behalf of the staff. I mean, they just did a heck of a job. I'm not sure the best answer after I got a little better sense of what I just received in terms of information. But in any event, remarkable report.
Hi, Susan, this is Daniel. I concur, really valuable, important work. Congratulations to all the team. I had one question, I think, for Avery, maybe Harriet as well. It was just about, first of all, I appreciate the depth of outreach to vulnerable communities and the specifics you offered for how we're responding to that. One of them you mentioned, Avery, was a educational video, which sounds like a great idea. And I'm just wondering, are we engaging the communities themselves in the design and production of that? Or is that something we've considered, and if so, how?
Yeah, great question. We've formed a group of community organizations who have been really involved in this process from the beginning. And most of them work in the Stockton area and are based in the Stockton area, and they've been giving us some great advice, including the recommendation to produce a video. However, I don't think that they have capacity to really, be deeply involved in the production of the video. So we've put together an outline and a script, and we're working with a consultant to do the production of the video. And we'll be meeting with those organizations next on December 2nd, and we'll be bringing some updates to them for feedback. So there will be opportunities to provide additional input, but we're trying to be respectful of their time and the fact that they have a lot of other things going on as well. So
I appreciate that. And I would just encourage, in getting that input, to be mindful that the lived experience those communities have is an expertise that we don't have, that should really be taken to heart in the decisions about how to design and frame that video. Thank you so much, Avery.
Definitely. We've heard that loud and clear from them as well. Thanks for the feedback.
I do have one question. I didn't see any mention of saltwater intrusion. I mean, to what extent is that impacted this particular study, and to what extent can we draw any conclusions on the obvious saltwater intrusion impact?
Yeah, Andrew, did you want to go ahead and take that?
Sure. So we looked at obviously sea level rise as a component, particularly of the water supply system. So when the time of year that we worry about saltwater intrusion is during the drier, warmer period where we're managing for water supply. And so that was where we really looked at whether salinity was going to penetrate further into the delta. And the way that the system operates is that the highest priority for the system to manage, and this is what's programmed into the model that we use, is to meet the salinity requirements and the other the water quality regulations in the delta first. So the first available water in the system goes to meet those requirements, and then water supply deliveries are made after that, basically. And what our modeling showed is, for the most part, the system is able to, sorry, working from home.
Awesome.
So I think he just got a really high score on a grade or something, on a test or something. He had to tell me right away. What we find is that the system is able to even with 2 feet of sea level rise, manage those regulations most of the time. So in most year types, we don't see salinity penetrating further into the delta at all, because we don't allow it to, basically, because the system is managed to keep pushing that salinity out. But in the future, and even now, we see it occasionally in rare years, where there's just not enough water in the system to keep that salinity out to manage all the regulations. That will happen in the future too, and it will become more severe and more common in the future, where we will have years where we have acute, penetration of salinity deeper into the delta. That will really affect in-delta water users because the water can become too saline for them to use. So yeah, we did look at that. We don't see it happening on a regular basis. It's not really a chronic problem. It's more of an acute problem during droughts. Good question.
So are there other questions from council members?
Yes, Madam Chair, I had a couple.
Oscar?
Yeah, thank you. And thank you, Andrew, for that. And Judge, I'd like to maybe take off from where you left off relative to the system and its capacity to withstand saltwater intrusion. I think that is just one component of a much larger system that we should be sounding the alarm loud and clear for everybody to hear, that the system that we have currently is not designed to withstand the multiple pronged challenges that we're going to face going forward under many of these scenarios that you've laid out. And so first of all, I want to say thank you to staff. This is an amazing product, and I know it's just getting started in many respects, but I think, you know, the real takeaway for me is what Andrew said, which is, you know, the way we manage our system right now is going to have to change. We are currently in a space where the entire water system that we have coming through the Delta is driven in large part by a series of seasons where we have snowpack, and then we manage the water accordingly. And if in fact much of what we're saying is that that system is no longer, that pathway for how we manage our water is no longer going to be what we are going to be receiving. And in fact, we're going to have to increase storage capacity because we're going to need to have the flows to manage the saltwater intrusion. We're going to need the water flows to manage the water temperature for fish. We're going to need all these things in a very different way. And so I'm just astounded at how complicated this process, if you really begin to think about it, is going to need to be going into the future. And I guess the thing that I would throw out is multi-benefit approaches, right? We are no longer able to address the complexity of all of the issues that have been addressed with equity and flooding and water supply and ecosystem in an isolated way. It's going to have to be multi-benefited approaches because there's only limited resources in terms of funding to manage a lot of our systems that we currently manage through the current resource and funding streams. So I would really encourage us and staff to, as we enter into finalizing, you know, the vulnerability component and then looking forward to the adaptation strategies, that we underscore heavily the need for multi-benefit approaches and sound the alarm for every single policymaker in the state of California to see what we're dealing with. Because as you said earlier in the staff report, this is designed to drive policy. And if folks are not recognizing the magnitude of what we're dealing with by the time it's front and center for most of us and throughout the state that don't deal with Delta issues on a daily basis, it will be too late to address systemic challenges. So I guess I would offer, Madam Chair, if I could, that this report, in the way it was presented, I think is so succinctly, it almost ought to be required as part of allowing folks to make public policy going into the future statewide, whether you live in the northern reaches of California or the southern or on the coast or further inland, you are part of a system that requires you to be aware that we're going to need to make major changes to our system if we're going to be able to withstand the prospects of some of the climate changes that are being referenced in this report. So I think the report and staff's ability to, or staff's the requirement that staff ought to be sharing this with everybody is essential going forward. But I love what staff has done. Harriet, thank you so much. Your staff has done an amazing job. Well, your colleagues have done an amazing job of laying out what I think is an essential step going forward in addressing the climate concerns we've all known about. Thank you.
I had one comment. I think it's very important for this document to be out there just because right now so much of infrastructure improvements are being planned and going through CEQA and going through all that without including this kind of finding and policy documents. Design of any system is not going to be effective and at some point is going to get stuck. So I think more than anything, our responsibility probably at this point would be to put this document out, especially to the agencies that are designing infrastructure in the Delta. So, and I thank you for this. It's very telling. I bet you the engineers were designing the tunnels and all that, and they haven't even, paid attention to this at this point. And it's very important to put it on the radar as a priority.
Yes. Well, thank you, council members, for your questions and comments. And I agree completely that it's very important that this document have widespread distribution. And in fact, at the Delta Plan Interagency Implementation Committee meeting, after we discussed this work, there was some discussion of using this information, and Harriet and her team working with the DPIC agencies to get this into regional reports, and also as part of the governor's new executive order. That work is launching at resources agency level, and Harriet and team will be working with those folks. I do have a question for along the lines of what Oscar was talking about. Andrew, on your dot areas, the source of vulnerability, moving forward, well, first off, I really appreciate how visual you are. Your presentation is quite clear and informative, and the visuals are really effective. What the dot is, your slide showing the red dot, blue dot, green dot. That raises a question for me as you move forward on the adaptation strategy. Have the folks you've reached out to jumped ahead or offered any ideas on, given your dot map, possible adaptation strategies in the red, blue, or green zones?
Yeah, that figure is actually a relatively new addition to our presentation. So it actually wasn't necessarily part of the presentation that we gave at the kind of earlier stages a month or two or three ago, as we really worked really closely with the Levy engineers on our findings and what the modeling was showing and ground truthing that. And so we have not had a chance to really have a discussion like that with them. And I think we're really looking forward to doing that next year as we really move into adaptation in earnest and think about what does that mean and how do you deal with it, these different impacts in different places, and what adaptation strategies are really available in different places.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Great. I look forward to that.
Madam Chair, can I ask one question of Andrew while he's on the screen there?
Yes.
Oh, Andrew, you referenced the idea of some of the flooding maps being able to be addressed in part, at least, with some targeted work or some targeted investments. But you didn't spend a lot of time on that. And I wondered if in the next iteration, the next component of the work, the adaptation strategies, if that is going to be referenced or identified, or what do you anticipate the levee work that's obviously everybody's interested and concerned about, and that's a central component of the flooding. What should we anticipate, or is that still wide open in terms of what will be included as part of an adaptation component coming forward?
Yeah, I think that will definitely be front and center. I think it is a bit wide open what the adaptation strategy really looks like at this point. We have a lot of conversations to have with lots of different folks to kind of figure out the best way to go about this. But that's certainly a big part of it. And the next presentation that you're going to hear with respect to the Delta Levy investment strategy is going to touch on kind of this, has some similar elements engaged in it too, in terms of what are the state assets or the state interests in the Delta, and population and loss of life is clearly something that we want to protect from both types of these projects. And we're going to have to figure out, what are the most important investments that we can make and to protect the things that we really, really care about. the Delta. So I just, while I've got the screen, I just want to respond to Councilmember Moranian's comment about the tunnels. And they actually are very interested in the folks that are designing that and working on that project have been engaged and paying attention to what we're doing and asking for briefings and
that's very important because, you know, that's my world. And I somehow all the time see how the engineers design things without having an understanding of these issues. And at the end, after 3 years of design and conceptual and actual documents, they come to find out that it's not where it needed to be.
Right. Yeah. So, yep, that's happening. There's lots of conversations. And I think that this information is starting to filter out into the world. We're getting lots of feedback and more interest from researchers and other folks that we somehow didn't talk to because it felt like we talked to everybody through this process. But coming and asking, you know, hey, can we get some of that? Can we get your data? Can we get your models? We want to build on this. So we're really excited about how others can stand on the work that we've done, which we're standing on the work of others before us. So it's great that it's building.
Yes, agreed. This is excellent work. Well, if there are no other questions from council members, is there any public comment?
Yes, OSHA Nazar would like to speak.
Okay.
And then
Good
we
morning,
have
OSHA.
after that.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Hi. Sorry, my name turned into caller 8 or something, so I need to fix that. Sorry about that. Yeah, thanks for the presentation. Super interesting. And I'm looking forward to the stakeholder meeting that we'll have in December to kind of get more into the details of this project. Couple things I just wanted to throw out there as initial comments is that I do think there should be a way. I know they're trying to make the maps not be too complicated, but I think it is important to designate separately the areas that we think under the modeling done here would be subject to flooding, but that are really intentionally flooded for habitat reasons, so that we can see the difference between areas that we actually are expecting and want to flood, like McCormick-Williamson Tract and places like that. And areas that, you know, have communities and farms and, you know, need to be protected. Also, you know, I do have a concern about the way that the information is presented and making sure that the assumption in the modeling is very clear about this is the without investments in levies scenario. I think it's fine if it's clear that's the baseline, and then we're going to talk about adaptations from that. But I don't think it's a reasonable scenario to say that there would not be continued investments in levies. And I was recalling back from the presentation that DWR gave to the council in November of last year. There was a graph on page 4 of that report. It was their D-list report to the council. And they showed very clearly that starting in 1995, the investments in levies began to ramp up, and that there was a very clear relationship between those increased investments and reduced failures of levies and increased levels of protection. And so, you know, there's been clear benefits from the investments in levies that have happened since that time, and the involvement of the state in that. And that's something that, you know, we believe strongly needs to continue. The other thing to kind of, and I think was alluded to in the report, in the reports that you heard from staff there, but I think is really important top line message out of this is that there's multiple benefits of levies. It's obviously protects from flood, you know, the communities, industry, and agriculture in the Delta and the cities, or, you know, that are within and next to the Delta, also habitat projects, but it's important, and I think not understood as well, how much levies protect statewide infrastructure things like highways, pipelines, communications, and then of course the state's water supply through State Water Project and CVP rely on water being able to get through the Delta safely. And that even with a tunnel, the proposal, the way it's presented now, is that the South Delta facilities would continue to be used. So there's not the need for water to be able to flow safely through the Delta is a continuing need. So there's statewide benefits, and I think we really need statewide investment from the beneficiaries of those benefits, and those costs may not have been shared in a way that they should be. So levies are critical to resiliency, and it's not an option to defund the levies in the future for a variety of reasons. So, maybe we need to get more creative about how to make that funding, put that funding together in a fair way that makes sure that the beneficiaries do all contribute. And I guess the last thing I'd say is, and I'll listen to the next presentation as well, is, and I think that the council will, but needs to be, integrated with the process that you guys are doing on the DLIS update, so that this can all be a comprehensive program and help inform folks about the importance of levies. Because I have been hearing, there's a lot of folks who just don't understand how levies have these multi-benefits, not just within the local area, but statewide. Thanks.
Great, thank you, OSHA. Are there any other public comments?
Yes, I think we have one from Brett Milligan. Brett, did you want to speak? It wasn't clear if he was going to send a message or not.
Yeah, this is Brett. Can you hear me?
Great. Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah, I had a question. Yeah, this is Brett Milligan, UC Davis. I have been serving on your TAC for this vulnerability portion, and I guess I and others are really curious. And I don't know if I can talk here or offline, but I'm really curious, sort of what are, as you've been developing this, what are you all thinking about in terms of the methods and ways that the adaptation portion of this is going to move forward, getting at some of the complexity of some of the comments that other people have proposed. And I'm just, if you have any thoughts on that, I think that would be really great to hear.
Brett, are you, and thank you for serving on, did you say that the technical group?
Yes, yes.
Yeah, thank you for taking the time to work with our team.
Oh, my pleasure.
Are you asking the council members or the team?
Oh, I guess it's the team. I would say the team, if they had thoughts on where they're going with
okay.
that.
Yeah, this is Jessica. Allow Harriet to express her thoughts. I'm sure she's been thinking about this a lot, but I think we're all anxious to get to that part of the discussion, and it's nearly impossible not to make that mental leap as we think about these impacts. But at least for our part, we've been hyper-focused on making sure we have the facts straight and that we've ground-truthed all the assumptions that are underlining our findings. So that we can then, go with full confidence into having informed discussions about adaptation. I would argue that a lot of the recommendations that are currently in the Delta Plan are likely, types of adaptation strategies. I think we may find that some need to be elevated above others or need to be refined or, but I think that offers a really good fertile ground for where we go forward. But I'll let Harriet answer because I know she's a little closer to this than I, and maybe she's put some more thought into it.
Yeah, no, I would just only add that, we have thought and talked a lot about adaptation potential strategies, but largely really on, where to make those levy investments, maybe upstream mitigation. Those are along the lines of what we've been talking about, but we haven't really fully dug in. And partially because we also have not had this conversation at a council meeting with the council members. So we're sort of still in the beginning stages of that. We have a lot of ideas, but we haven't run those to ground with our own team, with the council yet. So
So that's a big stay tuned, Brett, but we're really glad that you're part of the conversation. Thank you for that.
Thank you.
Well, if there are no other public comments on this item, I think we will move on to agenda item 7, Delta Levy Investment Strategy Update. And Jessica will give us the context.
Sure. Thank you, Chair Tatayan. And I think this is all a perfect segue to what we're talking about next. Our Delta Levy investment strategy has been a multi-year effort here at the council, and it's really focused on near-term investments, prioritizing near-term investments in Delta levies, but it's based upon a tool and information that can be updated as we go forward and have new information for future investments. So I just, to kick us off, flood risk and flood management, as we all know, are a constant in the Delta. And the imperative to plan and act on that only grows with climate change. The council shares authority over flood planning and protection activities in the Delta with many entities, and we can't achieve our mission without these strong partnerships. So that's the focus of today's discussion. Is we're going to have 2 of our major partners co-present with us. We have a formal memorandum of understanding with the Department of Water Resources and the Central Valley Flood Protection Board to execute activities in support of our Delta levies investment strategy. So here today, we're going to hear an update on the activities that are outlined in that MOU. Above all, really intentions to increase transparency in the way that the state funds Delta levies, and also, how we're thinking about prioritizing limited resources for investment now and in the future. Another topic of concern and interest is where will future funding come from? That's not a question that's probably going to be answered in today's discussion, but it's certainly one that we're interested in continuing to have at a high level. So with that, I'm happy to turn it over to Aaron Mullen.
No? Okay. Can you hear me?
A little bit muffled, Aaron.
Huh. I was trying some new headphones and nobody
that's
was
better.
Okay. I just need to get closer to my laptop. I just want to say that that's going to be a tough presentation to follow. Good job to the Delta Adapts team. So with that, good morning, everybody. And I wanted to thank you for the opportunity to present on one of the council's significant programs, which is the Delta Levy Investment Strategy. Okay, next slide. You're going to be hearing from a few people today. Jessica spoke to it a little bit. I'm going to go into it a bit deeper. I'm going to provide a bit of background for the program and an update on where we are in our efforts to update the data that informs our investment analysis. And then I'm going to hand it over to Ryan Stambra, who's going to address the accomplishments of our D-List Interagency MOU work group. We also have Laura Hollander from the Department of Water Resources and Darren Soon from the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, who are representing our partner agencies in the work group. They will be saying a few words about our agency's collaboration. Managing flood risk in the Delta is a complicated task, not only from a technical perspective, but from a logistical and jurisdictional perspective as well. The responsibility to manage the system is spread over multiple agencies, and I am proud of the MOU working group's effort to navigate this system. So I'm happy to be here today amongst my partners to talk about this. Okay, next slide. So what is the Delta Levy Investment Strategy? The D-List is a comprehensive investment strategy that aims to reduce risk to state interests by recommending strategic investments in Delta Levy maintenance and improvements. The Council has previously defined state interest as risk to public safety, property and infrastructure, water supply reliability, the Delta ecosystem, and Delta as place. Next slide. So why are we doing this? Well, because the Water Code told us to. Water Code Section 85306 says that the council, in consultation with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, so recommend in the Delta Plan priorities for state investment in levee operation, maintenance, and improvements in the Delta, including both levees that are part of the state plan of flood control and non-project levees. Next slide. I would like to take a moment to review the history of this program, kind of get you up to speed and remind everybody of what took place before now. The council spent 4 years building this investment strategy from the ground up. We started by identifying the issues and state interests in the Delta and assessing the risks. Part of this work included updates to the Chapter 7 of the Delta Plan. In 2018, the council adopted these updates and we prepared to begin the rulemaking process. We published our notice of proposed rulemaking on July 5th, 2019. Around the same time, DWR published its new Delta-wide land survey. The survey uses LIDAR technology to map the topography of the Delta, including Delta levees and island interiors. The council used the previous LIDAR survey done in 2007 to develop its risk assessment. When the council became aware that there was new data that could change our risk assessment, we formally withdrew from the rulemaking process so that we could update our assessment and revisit our risk analysis. That brings me to where we are today. Okay, next slide.
Yeah.
Council staff have been working hard to incorporate and update the risk assessment in a way that reflects the council's values. This means that we are using the best available science, working to be transparent, and we are seeking collaboration. In addition to updating the Delta levees, we have taken the opportunity to update our analysis with the hydrology that was developed for the Delta ADAPTS program, which you just heard about. We have shared our assumptions and methodologies with Delta engineers, RDs, and stakeholders. And we have worked with Delta interests to make sure that we have this right. That includes verifying the data that will go into the analysis, conducting listening sessions to get feedback and understand concerns, and holding technical meetings to go over our methodologies. Okay, next slide. So where are we now? In late October, we held 2 meetings with RD representatives and Delta engineers to discuss our preliminary results. We allowed them to get under the hood, so to speak, of how we reached our analysis, and we asked for feedback. The requested feedback is due by the end of November. Once we have that feedback and have had a chance to review it, we will incorporate what's appropriate into our data and update the decision support tool. Once we have updated the data set with the new information, we will run our decision support tool and see if the risks have changed. Once staff has had a chance to conclude this analysis, we will be bringing the results back to the council for your deliberation. This concludes my piece of the presentation, and I'm now going to hand this over to Ryan to discuss the accomplishments of the MOU working group. Thank you.
Great. Good morning, council members and Chair Tatayan. Thank you, Aaron, for turning that over and for kind of setting the tone for my remarks. We can go to the next slide, please, Brandon. So the purpose of my remarks today, as Aaron said, is to really provide an update on the activities of the DLIS MOU work group. However, I'd like to start off by highlighting what I believe is the general importance of the work group, which you will find on the left-hand portion of the slide. The 3 agencies that make up the work group all hold some degree of responsibility over shaping flood management in the Delta. This collaboration is incredibly invaluable as a result. It advances the major tenets of the work group, which are outlined. The first is a shared understanding, driven by a common body of knowledge that each agency can utilize as a basis for decisions. An example that promotes this concept is DWR's annual report on levy investments, which was presented for the first time last November, and that we anticipate the next iteration of coming in the upcoming months. Improved communication, the unique perspectives represented by the work group partners, as well as providing the ample opportunities for interaction and input with interested parties and members of the public, I believe will inevitably improve communication and understanding on this topic. And then finally, collaboration. The collaboration that advanced this work group allows the three agencies to really leverage and share resources, whether that be staff, outreach opportunities, knowledge, or data, all with the idea of promoting a more effective use of state funds in reducing flood risk in the Delta. The work group has been meeting every 2 to 3 weeks for going on, I believe, about 2 years now. And in my mind, the consistent and ongoing participation of each agency reinforces not only the value that each sees in the process, but is something that we at the council greatly appreciate and look forward to continuing to partner on. Now moving to the recent work group activities. The staff report and the right-hand portion of this slide lays out 4 themes that I intend to cover and that the work group has been focused on in the last 12 months or so. The first has been the co-management of the initiative's decision support tool. DLIS, as many know, is an information-driven policy that is only really as good as the data it is informed by. To this end, maintaining the decision support tool, which is really a tool that aggregates assets of each island coupled with each island's individual flood risk, remains of paramount importance. Over the last year, the work group has developed a draft maintenance plan with assigned roles and responsibilities for each of the agencies and anticipates having it finalized in the coming months. The next item is the update to the council, the Delta Plan's RRP1 regulatory language. In light of several factors, including new levy information, as Aaron noted, as well as the department's 2019 report to the council on levy investments, such an update may be appropriate. To date, the work group has been in discussions on potential concepts with the 2018 RRP1 draft language serving as a starting point. In other words, we have not been starting from scratch, but rather seek to build upon seek to explore additional opportunities to improve the regulation. At the appropriate time, council staff will be seeking input on the proposed regulatory revisions from members of the public and interested parties, and invite those interested to reach out to myself or Aaron to stay apprised of such opportunities going forward. As Jessica and Aaron both mentioned, transparency and communication, improving these two with regards to state investments and Delta levies has really been a driving force behind the work group from day one. For instance, an ongoing theme of this work has been to assess not only where investments are being made, but more importantly, the impact that those funds are having on reducing flood risk. With that in mind, the work group will continue to work towards ensuring that such decisions are not only communicated to the public, but to every extent possible, the public and interested parties has the opportunity to participate in the development and implementation of such policies. And then finally, the fourth item I'd like to just note is kind of issues of future focus. Going forward, there are obviously a number of issues that the work group hopes to engage on. And I think with the presentation that came before us on Delta Adapts, that's certainly one issue. However, before turning there, I'd like to first start on the funding aspect. As staff report notes, there are a few different pathways that are worthy of additional discussion. I would also note that the work group intends to further examine steps that can be taken to reduce flood risk in the Delta around things like emergency preparedness, appropriate land use, and other non-construction related activities. Further, given that funds are currently limited, it remains important to focus on projects that have multiple benefits, as Ms. Meserve pointed out. For instance, a flood risk reduction project that also includes an ecosystem enhancement or a protection of a transportation corridor or water supply deliveries. And then the second topic of focus is climate change and the impact that it will have on the Delta and how we manage flood risk. Climate change is occurring now. Its impact will only be more acutely felt in the coming years. And to that end, the work group will continue to track the best available information coming out on the topic, including what stems from the Council's Delta ADAPTS efforts to support and, to the extent possible, ensure that the state's investments in Delta levies reflect this dynamic reality and as well as promote as much kind of investment durability in state funds. At this time, that concludes my portion of the update, but I would like to invite Laura Hollander, Policy Advisor and Senior Legal Counsel for the Department of Water Resources, and Darren Soon, Policy Advisor and Principal Engineer for the Central Valley Flood Protection Board, to say a few words on their respective agencies' participation in the work group. Maybe I'll start with Laura.
Sure. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for this opportunity to join your meeting and present with the DSC and my colleagues at the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. As Darren mentioned, the work group has made significant progress in the last year on a number of items, specifically working through the revisions to the potential delist regulation revisions. We have spent many meetings talking through edits that would address both our three agencies' interests and stakeholder interests. We're getting close to some revised language there, as you heard. We have been working on the draft management plan, as you heard, for the decision risk support tool. We're very close to a draft that we will start to share. We look forward to more collaborative discussions on all the topics you heard about. And the work group has been sort of invaluable for our department in collaborating with the relevant state agencies in the Delta. So just wanted to thank all the agencies for their support of the MOU work group. And I'm happy to answer questions that any of you have.
Great, thanks, Laura. Darren.
Thank you, Ryan. Good morning, Chair Tatayan, members of the council. Darren Soon with the Central Valley Flood Protection Board. You know, about a year and a half ago, I came before this council just raising concerns because we at the board were wondering how this effort would affect the board's regulatory roles in operations and maintenance and proper construction in the system, which includes the Delta. I'm very pleased and grateful on behalf of the board to thank all of you at the council and staff for hearing our concerns and your willingness to engage in dialogue with us. Since then, I feel like, in speaking on behalf of the board, we've had great progress in collaboration. As you heard earlier today from Ryan and Laura, I think we're moving forward, progressing this policy, learning to work together, our three agencies within our respective roles. And really, I think it's really something to take note of. The people of California, I think, can be proud to see three state agencies coming together to further such a worthy mission in flood management, preserving our Delta, and making proper investments for the state of California. So we look forward to continuing this work and for finding future opportunities to partner and collaborate going forward. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Darren. In closing, I'd just like to thank Darren and Laura, as well as their colleagues and our partners in the work group from their respective agencies for their ongoing commitment to this effort. Certainly look forward to further discussions and keeping the council apprised of developments going forward. Madam Chair, that concludes our update. Aaron and I, as well as I believe Darren and Laura, if they're able to hang on the line, would be happy to answer any questions you may have.
Great, thank you. Thank you to all of you. You know, I agree with Darren completely. It is so terrific to see that the MOU working group folks are collaborating, and we are operating as best we can in a transparent manner. I look forward to all that you're doing, and the co-management of the decision support tool is one of the many important aspects. Do council members have any questions for any of the DLIST team folks? Well, hearing none, I do have a question. I think it was you, Ryan, who said that not only we're looking at not only where, or we would like to examine not only where investments are being made, but also evaluate the impact of those investments. Is there a kind of initial scoping of work that on how we might look at those impacts?
Yeah, that's a great question. And maybe I'll start off, and Aaron, feel free to jump in here as we move towards kind of the fragility curve discussions at all. But yeah, really, it is looking to assess, the development of the risk factors for DLIST were based on current conditions of delta levies. And what we hope that the tool can demonstrate over time is that as improvements are made, you will see the conditions as in the levy conditions improve, which would obviously dictate a change in kind of the fragility curves, or really an aspect of how we assess how vulnerable those levies are to failure. Aaron, I don't know if you want to jump in and if you have anything additional to share on that regard.
Yeah, actually, I thank you. I do have a few things I wanted to say. So, the team, as we talk internally, and for council staff, as we've talked about ideally how we can manage this program, our vision, once we kind of get into a kind of a regular cycle of reporting with DWR on its annual report, is that they will give it to us with enough time that we can then plug the information that they give us into the tool, and that we can run the tool. And when they present their report and discuss the investments that they've made in the previous year, that council staff can then present the council with an analysis that shows how that reduced risk at the same time. So we envision this to be kind of a collaborative kind of lock and key process where they're providing us the data, we run the tool, and then we can present basically what's been accomplished by these investments when they give their report.
Very good, thank you. So on the topic of funding, what are some of the thoughts of the work group members on the funding mechanisms? I think the Proposition 1E bond funds are fairly diminished. And I'm just wondering if any folks have offered any of the work group members any thoughts on future funding mechanisms.
Go ahead, Ryan.
Oh, I'll let you kick off, Darren.
Okay. Well, Chair Tatine, thank you for that question. We've begun conversations, at least about the aspiration of working together, developing programs, because we feel that this working group can be leveraged for other things going forward. And having said that, funding, I mean, we know we've got there's a one-time surplus that we're expecting in the budget this year. Perhaps there's an opportunity to develop something and seek funds that way. But we've just begun this conversation, whether it's a more longer term effort to try to get support for another bond measure, or join others. And we know there's conversations about a future bond as well. So perhaps we can join those conversations and seek funding for that route. So there's a couple opportunities, I think, there that we can take advantage of. But we don't have concrete at this time.
Yeah, one thing on my mind is, as we collaborate on the decision support tool, I think tracking what it takes to keep the levy system intact and is really valuable information out of that tool. And I'm imagining the database can provide information that policymakers and funding decision makers can get a sense of the magnitude of funding required merely to maintain, let alone improve the system. So I really think that the decision support tool, the database, would be quite useful, and the more we keep it up to date in current dollars, the more informative it can be to those who need to see the funding required to keep the system safe. Ryan, did you looked like you were going to add to?
Yeah, I would just echo a little bit of what Darren said in terms of from the work group standpoint, we are in a little bit of the early days on getting into and assessing and better understanding potential mechanisms. Obviously, two that are pointed out in the staff report are a couple options that come to mind. That's the reauthorization of the Sacramento-San Joaquin Drainage District. I believe that's also a recommendation in the plan as well. That obviously would grow the potential base of kind of available funding and really potentially provide a much more sustainable source of funds. But that obviously comes with some other considerations and challenges maybe as well. And then the second part is looking to kind of engage or re-explore the federal interest in delta levies as a mechanism for providing funding to in areas or in instances where levies fail and recovery and reconstruction is necessary as well. So I think like I said, I think we're in the early phases, but obviously what we see not only before us now, but as well as what the Delta Adapts data and modeling is telling us, is that the issues and challenges as it relates to flood risk management are only going to become more prevalent. And so exploration in terms of sustainable fund sources, I think will continue to be something that be very important.
Mm-hmm. Great, thank you. So council members, are there any additional questions for this panel?
Madam Chair, I did have one.
Mm-hmm.
If I could.
Oscar?
First of all, Aaron, thank you very much for the update, and Laura and Darren, good to see you as well. So I know that in the staff report at the bottom there, at the end of the update, there are questions to consider, and one of the questions starts off by identifying the fact that there are stakeholders that have questions about the alignment of the funding streams. And so I wondered if it might not be helpful for everybody to know who the stakeholders are and what those concerns are more specifically. It's difficult to consider questions without the context of the concerns and where they're coming from. It might help, at least for me, it would help put it in perspective as staff try to figure out how to address some of these concerns, because I think that's your question. Staff's, I'm assuming, Madam Chair, these questions are for the council to consider. It says, should council staff be looking at the distinction when presenting the updated DLIS information? And I don't know whether or not that's something that staff should be doing. I think so, but it might be helpful to have it in its context for me to help staff decide whether or not there needs to be more work in that space. I think so, but I don't know what the concerns are, or who the stakeholders are. And I think the stakeholder comments identified would be a little more telling. So I would offer that as a suggested response to what I think is a question for us to consider.
Aaron, do you want to take that one?
Sure, I can speak to that. One of the things that we've heard from some of the Delta engineers and as district representatives is that the way that the delist prioritization and the investment strategy currently functions is it doesn't draw a distinction between project levies and non-project levies and urban and rural systems, which have different funding streams, different partnerships, and different levels of state interest. So, and to get into that a little bit more deeply, and Darren can always talk about this as well. So if you were to propose a project on a project levy system, which belongs to the federal government, there's an increased chance of federal partnership. And so it's just, there's been a concern expressed to that the investment strategy as it stands right now doesn't really get into those nuances and doesn't really address how there's different ways to fund things, basically depending on who owns the levies and who's responsible for them. Does that clarify?
Yeah, no, it does. It's just I was struggling a little bit with trying to give what I think is some direction to the group or the staff, absent knowing kind of what the essential elements of those, and that makes sense to me. Obviously, we want to leverage. I mean, there's limited resources for these kinds of things, and so to the extent that we can leverage resources, makes all the sense in the world, given the conversation we've been having all morning. Yeah, thank you.
Darren, you look like did you want to add?
Well, I was just going to quickly say that what Aaron alluded to is that the challenge with the project levies is there's the federal government has its own lens in determining how it funds and chooses to prioritize investments. And so we as the state, as we, develop our own, whether it's the Delta levy investment strategy, in concert with any of our, the flood board and the DWR's state system-wide investment approach, those things will just have to be reconciled with the federal government if we want to try to leverage federal dollars. And so that's just the challenge that we have in front of us. But it doesn't take away from I think what the importance of the work that we're doing as a what I'll call local. Any non-federal entity is local as far as the federal government's concerned. But as far as our state decision and our perspective on what we see as a priority in the Delta, I think that this work is certainly meaningful and which shouldn't prevent us from going forward with this effort.
Great. I appreciate that, Darren. Well, if there are no other council questions, is there any public comment?
We have two. First is Gil Cosio, and then we'll hear from OSHA Reserve again.
Okay.
Hi, President Tatayan and members of the council. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Yes. Good morning, Gil.
We always have to ask that because we don't hear ourselves, so it's kind of interesting. So I've been wrestling with whether I wanted to comment after the Delta adapts or after DLIS. I chose to kind of comment after the DILS presentation, but my comments kind of hit on both because I think things have come up that I want to kind of explain our input on it. And for those of you that don't know me, we're one of those Delta engineers that Aaron Mullen mentioned. We've been talking to your staff and really appreciate the fact that they've kind of brought us into the fold. I mean, it's very complicated because there's a lot going on there. But on the other hand, it's encouraging to know that they are listening to what we have to say. And my thoughts may be a little bit random, but maybe through questions from the council, they'll become more clear. And I think my basic concern is there is no plan. And what I mean by that, when we talk about the Delta plan, it's a document that it's kind of unknown what fits in that plan until we do a consistency determination. Then someone at your shop tells us, yeah, it's consistent, or no, it isn't. But in my mind, I think we can be more detailed about the plan. Specifically with DLIS, I mean, we don't even know what the cost is to implement anything because we don't have a plan on what levies are going to be improved or not improved, that sort of thing. But then when I actually think about what's going to help the Delta in the future, I mean, I can come up with the plan myself and I'll throw it at you to see what you think. And the first thing I would think about, you know, we're wrestling with these tunnels right now. And regardless of whether we get tunnels or not, the fact remains that the Delta itself and the levees that make up the channels are going to be important to the water supply for the exporters, because all the water that goes through the Delta Cross Canal, Georgiana Slough, 3 Mile Slough, and heads down towards Old and Mill River is all conducted by Delta levees. So in my mind, there's a huge state interest in getting that water south. That being said, the Western islands, you know, are really important as far as water quality. If they breach and suck in salt water, then the state exporters and federal exporters have a problem with pumping water south. So if you start looking at all the levees that are involved in those two things, it's almost all the Delta. And if you think back of what's in the water code, and it's been there for a long time, is that the intent of the state is to keep the Delta in its current configuration. Now, there's a caveat that maybe some levees are not economically justifiable to keep up, but we haven't really gone through that yet. We haven't gone through that exercise. And then one of your co-equal goals is Delta's place. And I'm happy to see that the scientists are now going to be looking at the social science, because I think that's going to add a lot to what that Delta's place means. And again, I think you're going to realize that a lot of the levees have to stay up to keep a vibrant farm economy going, that then helps to keep the Delta's place. Otherwise, the Delta is just going to become abandoned, that sort of thing. And then finally, the levees in their current configuration protect all the habitat in the Delta except open water. And, you know, there's habitat within the islands, there's habitat on the levees, and there's habitat within the levee systems that are known as tule berms or remnant islands, that sort of thing. Without the levees, those are all gone. And so in my mind, we could actually sit down and I know it's hard for people to think this way, but all the levees in the primary zone of the Delta are important to keep up. And we can give you a number on what that's going to cost. And then the DLIS can start thinking, okay, we're shooting for $1 billion or $2 billion, whatever that is. And without that, we're kind of wandering in the dark until we hit the consistency request and we fill out our forms and send it to you, and then have to justify why we think it's consistent with your plan. But because there isn't really a plan, and it's hard sometimes to think about the fact that people keep saying there's not enough money. We know there's not enough money to fix these levees, but living on bonds, we're working hard to keep that money going. In fact, one of the issues we're dealing with right now is Prop 1 money, which allocated $295 million to the Delta levees. And it was very specific. It covered 3 things. It covered the Delta Levy Special Projects Program, it covered the Delta Levy Subventions Program, and it covers emergency response. And we've been concerned that some of that money has been spent outside those 3 priorities. And so we brought that issue up with UWR, and we're working with them to figure out how to spend the rest of the $199 million that's left in Prop 1. So we've got, you know, $199 million left. So we've got a few years to work on that, and hopefully a new bond, like Darren said, there's always a bond in the works. Whether during the economic times we're in now, we're going to be able to pass a bond in the next couple of years is questionable, but obviously we're always thinking about that. Anyway, that being said, like I said, Prop 1 was very specific on where the money was going to be spent. And I think in DWR's annual report to you a year ago, I think they kind of made that point that one of the problems with the DLIS is that the tool kind of throws the entire delta into the DLIS. And so right away, we have levies that are going to be highest priority because they protect a lot of people, like West Sacramento and the Pocket area and RD-17 down in the South Delta. But in reality, if you think about something like Prop 1, that was very specific to the levies in the primary zone of the Delta, because nobody else qualifies for those three items that it's specified to fund. And so the way the money comes out of bonds or out of the budget is very specific. And so the DLIS, like Aaron was explaining, has to, as we've been commenting, has to separate those pots of money and maybe have different investment strategies on how the pot comes out. To put it all in one pot is very, is not really realistic. In fact, this afternoon, the Delta Protection Commission is going to discuss a letter to send to the Legislative Caucus to explain to them that, you know, Prop 1 was very specific on how the money should be spent. We're concerned about some of it that's been spent outside of those three items that were very specific in the bond measure. And so we're happy that they're supporting us in keeping that money where it's supposed to go, where the voters asked for it to go. But yeah, we don't know exactly what we're going to have in the future, but we can plan for it. I mean, look, really, we can come up with a number if we want to maintain all the levies in the Delta, 90%, whatever the number is, we can estimate that number. And I think that would help you as far as a plan, because right now I don't see a plan. As an engineer, I guess my plan would be what levies are we going to keep up. And I don't see that now. And that's, I think, where we add a lot of confusion, because it's hard for someone like your staff to look at Delta ADAPTs and say, well, there's no plan to keep these levies up. So right now we have to assume that no money will be spent. So whatever happens in the future is going to be affecting the conditions today, which is not true. I mean, even if we didn't get state or federal money, the farmers out there would do as much as they can. And right now they're contributing about at least 25% to the work that we do out there. So it'll happen slower, but certainly some work will happen. So anyway, like I said, my thoughts are a little bit random, but hopefully some questions will come up from the council here that maybe I can explain better what I'm talking about. Thank you.
Well, I think Councilmember Gill is offering to answer any questions we might have about what he has shared with us. Well, hearing none, thank you, Gil, for taking the time.
You're welcome.
And our next public comment is from OSHA, is my understanding.
Yes. OSHA, you can unmute yourself.
Hi, thank you. OSHA Reserve, local agencies of the North Delta. I think Gilbert made a lot of points that a lot better than I could about this topic, but I just kind of want to stay engaged with the council on moving forward toward hopefully a prioritization that better reflects the complexities that staff was talking about and that Gilbert mentioned. Because, you know, we really, if to the extent that the prioritization that the council is trying to provide is useful, it really needs to, you know, take into account perhaps a broader, more factors than it did last time around. So I guess, you know, I think I've said this before, but I think it's a bit more than the updated bathymetry that I think Delta stakeholders are looking at, hoping to get out of a new DLIS prioritization. And I know that Melinda Terry and I had worked a couple years back about, you know, kind of a different way to try to more carefully weigh the priorities so that it wouldn't, you know, spit out an answer that, for instance, only would provide priority to areas that have the most people, which has been pointed out. Often there's other flood monies that are available for urban areas, for instance, or areas that are behind federal levies versus the state, which I think the priorities that the council is trying to provide should be for state expenditures. So trying to look at make sure that we look at criteria like including the water supply reliability, ecosystem goals, delta as a place, local and regional property protection, and then the state interest protection. And that would be those other types of infrastructure that is protected by delta levies. So if we, and population protection is obviously one of those factors in there, but maybe should not be the only one. And then we might also want to put in there, the availability of other dedicated funds. So I think just, we're looking for hopefully something that's more helpful and more on point, and that maybe, could be followed more carefully in the future. I think in addition, as Gilbert alluded, there may be an opportunity and even a need for the council to assist in providing some kind of, oversight or feedback on how levy funds dedicated for levies and flood control actually are spent from past and future bond funds, because bond accountability is a big issue for taxpayers across the entire state, as well as here in Sacramento and more locally. So thanks.
Chair Tyan, I think you're on mute.
Sorry about that. I was saying if there are no other public comments, I want to say thank you to Darren and Laura for being with us here today, and to the entire team working on the DLIS effort. It's to me a long-term collaboration among our agencies, and I'm really happy to see that it's working well and the MOU working group is effective. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
So on to our next agenda item, update from our Delta lead scientist, Dr. Laurel Larson.
Hello. I'm not sure why you can't see me right now. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Dr. Larson.
Oh, wait. There we are. Okay. I just had a paper covering my camera. Well, it's great to see all of you again. I hope your month is off to a good start. I do have a graphical abstract that I'm going to be showing, so I'm just hoping the slide will come up shortly.
I'll be sharing that really quick, Laurel.
Okay. Okay, I'm going to structure this lead scientist report by spotlighting an article that appeared it's actually in press right now in Ecological Applications. It is accessible online at this time, even though it's not officially in an issue yet. So I'll be spotlighting that article, and then I'll speak about some of the current activities within the Delta Science program, and then a few items that should be on your radar as well. So just to tie this into what we've been speaking about over the last few months, last month I highlighted an article that achieved synthesis of long-term fish monitoring data in the Delta and provided us with a closer look at differences between different fish surveys and implications for detecting and interpreting trends in the data. But I promised you last month that this month we would return to the discussion about drought that featured prominently in the previous reports. So this month's article spotlight is a nice combination of these previous themes. It uses the long-term fish monitoring data from multiple sources to evaluate impacts of drought on different fish populations over a 5 decades long plus period of data collection. So this is a study that was led by Brian Mahardia at the Fish and Wildlife Service, but Steve Culberson of the Interagency Ecological Program and Louise Conrad of the Delta Science Program are both co-authors on this paper. So it's very close to the Delta Science Program. Well, one of the things we talked about last month was about the importance of using multiple fish data sets to draw conclusions about trends. This is a study that does just that. It uses data from the Department of Fish and Wildlife's fall midwater trawl monitoring program, which targets fish that live in open water environments, often referred to as pelagic fish. The second data set comes from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service Delta Juvenile Fish Monitoring Program, which samples fish that primarily occupy shallow vegetated habitats at the margins or near shore portions of the Delta. And these are often referred to as littoral fish. The data spans the period of 1967 to 2017, and the authors first identified droughts that happened during this period of time based on data from the Department of Water Resources Water Year Hydrologic Classification Index. They then asked two questions about the impacts of these droughts. First is, do fish species exhibit drought resistance? In other words, how stable are their population numbers during the drought years? And then secondly, do fish species recover from drought when wet conditions return? Ecologists use the term resilience to describe this ability to recover, and it is measured by evaluating the extent of rebound in fish population numbers in the year following these drought periods. So in this study, the authors were interested in comparing and contrasting the answers to these questions among several different categories of fish species. For example, did the resistance and resilience to drought vary among fish from different habitats, here the open water and marginal zones? And did resistance and resilience differ for native versus non-native fish species? And I will take you through what these charts are showing, but I'll just go ahead and mention that in the charts, the native species are not highlighted in green, whereas the non-native species are highlighted in green. Now, to answer those two questions that I just talked about, statistical modeling was necessary, and this was needed in order to properly account for uncertainty. The uncertainty in this analysis arises from two main sources. One is not completely knowing how representative the sampled fish from the monitoring studies are of the whole Delta population. And the second is uncertainty that arises from the fact that populations naturally fluctuate randomly, which can make it difficult to distinguish between a downward trend in population that results from drought and a decrease in population numbers that would have occurred anyway, just due to random processes like mating success. To account for those uncertainties, the model is grounded in estimates of probabilities or likelihoods, and it produces estimates of the most likely drought resistance or resilience coefficients, as well as a range of the reasonably possible values given the data. So the way to interpret these drought resistance or resilience coefficients, which is what is being shown on the chart, is simple. Negative coefficients here, so coefficients on the left side of the chart, the left of that vertical line, mean that the population declined during drought. So that would be the top portion of the table, or declined during the post-drought period in the bottom portion of the table for the case of the resilience coefficient. Positive values mean an increase in population. And this figure shows the model results for just one of the droughts in the record. The most recent one was between 2012 and 2016. Now, one other thing bears explanation in these charts, and that is the use of the closed and the open circles. Here, the closed circles indicate a high statistical confidence that the population either declined or gained over the period of time of interest. In other words, the uncertainty bounds of those coefficients does not intersect zero, whereas the open circles mean that there's a little bit less confidence that you're actually seeing a negative trend or a positive trend. So I've also distinguished between the water column dwelling versus the marginal fish here. The water column dwelling fish species are at the top of each one of these charts, and the marginal ones are at the bottom of each of these charts. And as I said before, I've highlighted the non-native fish species in green. So first of all, what you see from these figures is that the native species, again, those not highlighted in green, are the ones that experienced the most substantial declines in the 2012 to 2016 drought. So this is the top figure that you're looking at. And these were the only declines with a high degree of statistical confidence. And this includes delta smelt. For historical droughts not shown in this particular figure, native species would often exhibit more resilience or recovery compared to non-native species, but this wasn't the case during the recent drought. So some species exhibited some recovery, and 2 non-native species exhibited recovery that we are confident in, statistically speaking. Recovery for the other species was not back to the pre-drought baseline, and this held true over the entire set of droughts examined. And Delta smelt in particular did poorly. So thus, the authors concluded that even high freshwater flows, as we saw in 2017 after the drought, aren't enough to conserve and promote recovery of fish populations in the face of drought. While maintaining appropriate volumes and timing of freshwater flow is important, supplementing fish populations with hatchery stock and performing other conservation measures such as habitat restoration, invasive species management, and reduced contaminant loading might also be necessary. Now, another important conclusion that comes from looking across multiple droughts in this manner is that littoral species, or the margin-dwelling fish, tended to do better than pelagic species during drought. In other words, the points on the bottom of these charts tended to be shifted to the right compared to points at the top. You can kind of see this as you squint at the chart shown, but the pattern did tend to be clearer for the other droughts analyzed. Sometimes the littoral species even increased in dominance during the drought, experiencing positive coefficients. Extrapolating these results, the authors suggested that with more droughts in the future, we might see a shift in the dominance of fish communities in the Delta away from these pelagic or open water species and towards the littoral or margin-dwelling species. Now, often the pelagic species will rebound following drought, but again, this is often not to pre-drought baselines. In the case of the Delta smelt following the recent drought, the authors suggested that this lack of recovery may have been a result of water quality conditions, namely temperature, high temperatures. So just to wrap this up, this study is a really good example of the goal of capitalizing on science synthesis called for in the Science Action Agenda. And it also addresses Action 4C of the Science Action Agenda, which advocates for understanding relationships between flows and aquatic species. Now, I know a lot of council members are interested in concrete actions that might be suggested by these studies. And here, in terms of concrete actions, this study suggests that pelagic species should really be the focus for management actions that really target conservation and recovery. And it, like some of the previous papers we considered, also argues for the importance of hatchery operations to aid in conservation efforts during drought periods. Regarding Delta smelt, the authors emphasize the overriding importance of maintaining flows during drought periods that balance human and environmental needs, with particular emphasis on the timing of those flows and management of those flows so as to ensure favorable temperatures for the fish. So I'll pause here and ask if there are any questions on this article spotlight before I move on to highlight some current activities of the Delta Science program.
I have a question. Thank you for your presentation. My question was, when you did the comparison of native versus non-native species and how they're more resilient, the native is more resilient than the non-native. Is there any data set or any analysis that showed how, like, the resistance of the levels of resistance before something totally is stop of being there or something? Is there any data set showing that? What is the breaking point of the non-native, of the native, if any, in this?
That's a really good question. So one of the tenets of resilience thinking in ecology is that these populations can absorb a certain amount of stress to their system before they exhibit declines in population. So looking at resilience in that manner, like how much stress can these populations actually absorb before they change, was not one of the things that was done in this study. I don't know if others have looked at that question here in the Delta, but that is certainly something I could dig into a little bit further and ask around about. But that's a really great question, and certainly an important one in anticipating how to manage these populations in the future.
Yeah, because it will be also an indicator of our timing of introducing certain kind of, let's say, solutions to delay that or postpone, or, you know.
Yeah, or addressing the question of how fast we actually need to act if a drought is rapidly developing.
Yeah, yes.
Yeah, that's a fantastic research question. I will make note of that.
Sure, great, thank you.
This is Daniel. I actually have kind of a communications question just for you to ponder with us. You made reference to balancing human and environmental needs, and that's a phrase I think I've used verbatim in the past, but for some reason hearing it today, it felt like it might obscure the core truth that we humans are as dependent on a healthy environment as anyone, any species. And just, you don't even have to give your thoughts right now. I just wanted to put it out there that maybe that frame is not exactly conducive to a deeper public understanding of our interdependence.
Yeah, that's something I would love to discuss further with you. Can you maybe elaborate a little bit on why? Or we could reserve that discussion for the future.
He may be on mute, but he was also having technical difficulties earlier.
Okay.
Yeah, it does actually. It looks like we just lost him.
Yeah, I think we did.
Oh, that's too bad. Well, shall we move on? Are there any other questions? Okay, in that case, I will move on and discuss some of the current activities within the science program. Last month, I talked about our proposal solicitation notice, or PSN. I'm very excited to report that the finalized version of the proposal solicitation notice, after public comments, was launched 2 Mondays ago on November 9th, and it has been distributed widely to a network of national and international colleagues, as well as to the Delta research community. Just as a reminder, we are soliciting proposals for 12 to 31 month duration projects that directly inform Delta natural resource management and advocate the 2017 to 2021 science action agenda. While we have a standard research award track, we are also newly soliciting large interdisciplinary proposals for integrated socio-ecological systems research. Some important deadlines to be aware of are that we're requesting letters of intent by December 15th in order to put together review panels with the appropriate expertise. And then the final proposals will be due on February 12th. We're also hosting informational webinars on the proposal process on December 2nd and January 8th. And we're encouraging prospective PIs to bring their questions about the process of this proposal solicitation to those webinars. Moving on, I'm also going to give a short summary of the zooplankton symposium that was hosted by the Delta Science Program along with CDFW and Department of Water Resources on October 27th through 28th. So more specifically, this was a symposium on zooplankton data, monitoring, and ecology. And just to provide some background, zooplankton provide a critical link in Delta food webs. They consume algae, which is changing in abundance and composition as a result of climate change, changes in nutrients, and species invasion. In turn, they provide a critical food source for many Delta fish, and hence are important for the management of fish species. And they're a component of food webs that are responding to changes at the base of the food web, and those changes are expected to propagate through zooplankton upwards to higher levels of food webs to fish. So the symposium featured speakers from government agencies, consulting firms, and academia as well as other, and the focus of their research was the San Francisco estuary, as well as other aquatic and marine systems in California and other states as well. The first day featured talks and discussions on zooplankton monitoring in the San Francisco estuary, data integration and interoperability, management relevance, and advanced technologies for monitoring. And then the second day featured talks by leading zooplankton experts on zooplankton ecology and biology. Of particular interest in this meeting were topics of high management relevance, such as habitat restoration, outflow, carbon cycling, harmful invasive species, and climate change. The symposium attendance was quite high, peaking at around 150 people, and the audience was engaged with a particularly lively and active conversation, both verbally and in the meeting chat. So a more detailed presentation of results from that symposium will be coming soon. Now, there's a few items on your radar that I would like to highlight. First of all, last month I talked about the Bay Delta Science Conference, which as a reminder is coming up on April 6th through 9th, 2021. The theme for this completely virtual conference is building resilience through diversity in science. The update with that is that the abstract deadline was just extended to December 28th, so by about a month. Putting that after the holidays, I think will give people more time to put together abstracts for talks, posters, and also special session proposals. Another thing coming up on your radar is the Steelhead Trout Workshop. This is the 2021 California Central Valley Steelhead Workshop, and it will be held over 3 half days between February 16th and February 18th of the new year. And the impetus for this workshop was a biological opinion on the long-term operation of the Central Valley Project and State Water Project -3.6.2. The biological opinion requires the U.S. Bureau of Reclamation to coordinate with the Collaborative Science and Adaptive Management Program, or CSAMP, to sponsor a workshop for developing a plan to monitor steelhead populations within the San Joaquin Basin and/or the San Joaquin River downstream of the confluence of the Stanislaus River. This includes steelhead and rainbow trout on non-project San Joaquin tributaries as well. The workshop represents a collaborative effort then between the Council, U.S. Bureau of Reclamation, and the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, as well as the Metropolitan Water District, California Department of Water Resources, California Department of Fish and Wildlife, and the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. Anticipated topics to be discussed include historic and ongoing steelhead monitoring programs, and there's a plan to identify collaborations and partnerships that affect the development of comprehensive monitoring. Some other topics include exploring analytical approaches for measuring the impact of management actions and discussing what information is needed to address the impact of management actions, methods for acquiring that information, and spatial and temporal requirements. Another item on your radar is the Adaptive Management Forum. The Save the Date announcement for that just went out today. The 2021 Adaptive Management Forum will be held virtually on February 3rd through 5th, 2021. And by the way, this is something that's not in your written packet because it is hot off the press. The goals of the 2021 Adaptive Management Forum are to synthesize lessons learned from prior ecosystem restoration and water management projects and research efforts. Secondly, to foster information sharing about adaptive management. Third, to strengthen science management interactions by connecting decision makers, practitioners, stakeholders, and scientists. And then fourth, to stimulate dialogue around a shared vision of adaptive management. The forum will feature presentations by invited speakers, followed by Q&A sessions and breakout discussions. And then in the afternoon, interactive workshops will be held to provide opportunities for forum participants to receive hands-on training focused on specific adaptive management tools and practices. And this includes adaptive management and monitoring plans, permitting, and the new Delta landscape scenario planning tool. A detailed agenda for this meeting will be posted soon, and registration will be announced through the Council's listserv in December, so next month. And then finally, I'll just do a quick recap of your by the numbers summary, which again is in your packet. And just very briefly, it's looking very much like drought conditions out there. Cumulative precipitation in the Sierras right now is only 17 to 19% of average values for this time of year. And that might be due to a delayed start of the rainy season. Water temperatures are also warm by 4 to 14 degrees Fahrenheit. Reservoirs are 65 to 79% full, and flows of the Sacramento and San Joaquin rivers are at about the same percentage, around high 60s through 70s. Consequently, diversions are at the low level of 31% of their average value for November. So with that, I will stop and see if there are any questions and or public comments.
Are there any other questions for Dr. Larson? Hearing none, is there any public comment?
There's no public comment.
Great.
And Chair Tatian, if I might just say one more thing.
Sure.
I'm very much looking forward to being in California, and hopefully when this pandemic is behind us, meeting all of you in person. Next month during the council meeting, I will be newly arrived in California and very much involved in moving from Berkeley to Sacramento. So Louise Conrad is going to step in for me next month, and then I'll see you all again in January.
Great, thank you.
Madam Chair?
Yes.
I have a comment, maybe a question perhaps and a comment, but you know, I think the pandemic has caused us to operate in silos, unfortunately. And I would, for example, we heard a remarkable report on Delta adapts and the effect of climate change on the Delta. I would like to see Dr. Larson review that, such as it is now. I mean, I know so I don't want to give her more work than she probably needs to have, but I would think her comments and her analysis would be very fruitful for us. And I say that because I know that she's obviously not here. And as I said, the tendency is, I think, to operate in silos now. And I understand that's perfectly understandable. But somehow I would think that some cross-pollination ought to take place, and in preparation for perhaps Dr. Larson's arrival on the scene here, maybe some kind of discussion between her and Delta Adapts would be very appropriate. So for what it's worth, I'd like to see her comments or hear her thoughts about that particular presentation that we heard today.
It's an excellent presentation. Oh, sorry. It is an excellent presentation, and actually I have been meeting with that group most recently, just a few days ago, and the presentation was a topic of discussion. So we'll continue those meetings and encourage as much cross-pollination as possible.
Chair Tatian, sorry to interrupt, but I wanted to note that Councilmember Zingali is back on the line. So if we wanted to circle back to his question, we could do so.
Okay.
Oh, thank you, Jessica. Yeah, sorry, y'all. I dropped off kind of mid-question, but I think you got the gist of it, Dr. Larson. I'm curious if you had any reaction.
I actually had another question for you, which was to elaborate on why the managing environmental flows for both human and natural resource management might not be the most productive framing for this topic.
Yeah, no, that actually, the way you just framed it, I don't see as problematic. I was reacting more to, and again, zero judgment, because I think I've framed it this way many times, but it was more along the lines of human versus environmental needs. So, putting those juxtaposing.
Yeah, putting them at odds with each other.
Yeah. So I know you understand why I'm asking better than I do.
Yes, the goals should be co-equal rather than counter to each other. I agree with that.
Yeah, something like that. Yeah. Thank you.
If I may, I just want to add that that question prompted a memory for me of a PPIC report that came out within the last few months, where they do start to really dig into traditionally what we've thought of as environmental flows, and are they really dedicated to the environment, or do they also serve multiple functions in terms of, you know, direct human uses like keeping water fresh for human consumption, agriculture, etc. So you tapped into something there, Councilmember Zingali, that's actually the subject of a lot of debate. So I think it's appropriate for us to re-examine from time to time how we're framing it as well.
Oh, thanks for that. I'll read up on some of that history, starting with the QPIC. Thank you.
Excellent comment. Thanks.
Well, are there any public comments, Lita, on the lead scientist report?
There are no public comments for lead scientist and no general comments.
Okay. Well, good luck and safe travels in your big move, Laurel.
Thank you.
It'll be
Chair
nice to have you
Tatian.
back in California.
Thank you.
And since there are no public comments in general, we'll move on to the last agenda item, which is to talk about our next meeting, which will likely be remote, virtual again. So with that, I wish you all a happy Thanksgiving, happy, safe, and enjoyable Thanksgiving, and we'll see you next month.
Thank you, Chair Tatian. Thank you, everybody.
Yep. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, you guys.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Integral.